when government debt is backed up by the ability of government to get cash from the public.
Time and time again over the last 30 years we've seen private debts being transformed into public debts, and ultimately the price of that debt is paid by the public in the debtor country.
This is why spending cuts are necessary. The system is designed to make certain people very rich at the expense of a nation's citizens and taxpayers. The system lowers the standard of living of the majority and distributes this wealth among the privileged.
So what we're left with is a financial system since the early 70s that has no fixed exchange rates, that suddenly has increasingly open financial borders, that has central banks having to manage without having any control because there's nothing here where the gold used to be. Chaotically, they have to ease quantitatively. They have to lend as a lender of last resort.
Throughout history, monetary systems were designed to give the dominant international power an advantage, and this power is fiercely defended and expanded on.
And they flee in terror from an incredible bogeyman.
An American flag is burned at the height of the demonstration. Both President Johnson and Francisco Franco were vilified. A new low in public protest added strain on Spanish-American relations.
Order in the car! Order in the car!
I want Americans and all the world to know.
Come on, fire!
I want Americans and all the world to know. America has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality.
Fire! Objection overruled!
What I would like to see is a new kind of currency that is backed by something that is scarce and that we really need and we really value, something like energy or renewable energy, for example. So a sort of kilowatt-hour backed currency would be very interesting to me. We need to start valuing the things that are most scarce and that we need to survive as a human race in the long run, and backing an international currency with something like that will generate enormous investment in, for example, renewable energy, if that's the primary international unit of account that's being used. Another option is a basket of currencies, so you mix up the value of different currencies to create a very solid currency that people have confidence in.
Perhaps even better would be a basket of commodities with which to back up international currencies.
Now, if it was possible, internationally, some way or another, to get all these competing and increasingly competing national economies together and say, we're all going to sit down and write out an agreement, somewhat like the Bretton Woods Agreement, which will allow for, unlike Bretton Woods, allow for some currencies to be pegged against different baskets of goods that are more appropriate to their national economies. And you can sort of arrange this. If you could arrange that to happen, then that would be nice, and you can see how that would start to create a kind of order in the international macroeconomy, which is otherwise lacking. The real difficulty there is just political. It's like, who on earth is going to do this? Who is the force that's going to kind of make this thing happen?
Creating a monetary system which is both fair and stable is possible and can be achieved. What are international organisations for, if not for such a purpose?
Banks are the most heavily subsidised businesses in the world, specially protected by governments. While the money runs out for the rest of us, the largest private banks still thrive. This is because they get the biggest subsidy of them all.
The license to print
money.
Hard to believe? Martin Wolf, the chief economics editor at the Financial Times, said it recently. The essence of the contemporary monetary system is the creation of money out of nothing by private banks, often foolish lending. You heard that right. Private banks create money out of nothing. Then they loan it to us and ask for interest on top. If you've ever wondered why the bank buildings around the world soar higher than any palace or spire ever did, you now have the answer. But the banks don't simply print money using secret printing presses in their basements. They don't have to. Like so many other things these days, printing money has now gone digital. With the popular use of debit cards, electronic fund transfers and internet banking, only 3% of the money in the UK is now made of paper and metal coin. The other 97% is entirely in computers. Electronic money is convenient for everyone, but it's especially convenient for the private banks, since they own, run, and control the entire digital money system. And what do they do with this special privilege? Do they channel new money, the blood supply of the nation, towards the things we need, like hospitals, schools, universities and public transport? Not if it doesn't make a profit for them. Instead, they use their license to print money to gamble on the financial markets and push house prices out of reach of ordinary people by pumping hundreds of billions of pounds into risky mortgages. This is exactly how the banks caused the financial crisis. And now the rest of us are being asked to pay for it. If we can't afford to run hospitals and build schools, can we really afford to subsidise the financial industry? Should we have to live with less so the bankers can have more? This is ludicrous, and it's time to put a stop to it. The private banks can't be trusted to hold the reins to our entire economy. We need to take away the bank's power to create money out of nothing. This will stop them from causing yet another financial meltdown and allow us to afford the crucial services that we as a society need.
What does a progressive financial system look like? And I want to hear what some of you think. Who thinks, for example, that we should ban banks from creating money?
Control over how money is created and what it's used for is a democratic issue. You currently have the banking sector, profit-seeking banking sector, not accountable to anybody other than themselves, who are creating up to £200 billion a year of new spending power and deciding where in the economy that goes.
Monetary reformers believe that that entire money supply should be for the benefit of the public and should never be created by a private organisation as debt.
Democratising the money supply, what that means is putting the power to issue and allocate money back into the hands of people, taking it away from private organisations, institutions that don't actually represent the people, that are not democratically accountable to the people. The banks aren't democratically accountable. They're accountable to their shareholders and their shareholders only. Now they're underwritten by us, by the taxpayer, but they're not accountable to us. That doesn't make any sense at all. So if you democratise the monetary system, you are subjecting it to the same kinds of discipline as the education system, as the health service, and other key publicly needed services. There's no reason that money should be viewed as any different. It is a fundamentally important service that everybody needs. I can't survive without enough money. Nobody can. So it cannot be controlled purely by this small elite of big banks as it is in the UK. We do need a different system.
We believe that the activity of supplying a nation with money should be completely separate from the activity of banking.
What we need to do now is update that law from 1844 to make the digital money real money. Real, it could be electronic money, but it needs to be classified as money.
We just want banks to be like every other private organisation, private company in the economy, to be subject to market discipline.
The problem is that now we're in this hybrid model where we have no control of how they spend the money, which creates our money, but also we're reliant on them to create our money.
We're all constantly in debt. We'll be in debt pretty much for the rest of our lives, and the younger generations have it even worse than the older generations.
I've just been reading a report from the United Nations Environment Programme, and they say we need $2 trillion a year. 2 trillion, can you imagine what 2 trillion is? It's a lot of money. A year to finance the greening of the economy, to move away from poisonous carbon, which is poisoning the atmosphere, to alternatives to carbon. When the banks collapsed in 2007-9, we found, according to the Bank of England, not me, the Bank of England tells me that we raised $14 trillion in a year to bail out the banks. So against that $2 trillion a year to bail out the ecosystem, is no big deal.
This kind of model doesn't make any sense, either from an orthodox free market perspective, because these banks are monopolists. Effectively, they monopolise credit creation, so they don't obey the rules of any kind of free market discipline. Yet at the same time, they're not producing socially or environmentally beneficial outcomes along any real kind of scale.
All that money does is enable us to do what we can do. And once we get our heads around that, we can make money work for what we need.
The power to create money is so powerful. You've got to be very concerned about who has that power. If it's somebody who's going to benefit from creating the money, then they're going to have the incentive to create more than the economy actually needs. The same would probably happen if you give that power to politicians. You can't trust a politician to be trying to please voters and to have power over creating money at the same time. It's a real conflict of interest. The only thing you really can do is to give it to somebody who has no conflict of interest, an independent, transparent, accountable body.
Money could be allocated according to the needs and desires of the population. Systems could be put in place to allow for direct democratic allocation of funds, either wholly or partially. A framework and rules could be established to incorporate up-to-date economic theory into how much money should be created and for what types of purposes. The government would no longer be able to get access to large sums of money to pursue armed conflict if this was not sanctioned by the populace.
We would be able to see exactly what they're doing with the power to create money. We'd be able to see how much they're creating and where that money is going. And that's pretty much the only way we can get control over the power to create money and stop it being abused.
The Money Reform Party was established in 2005, just after the 2005 general election. The idea of the Money Reform Party was that we would have this basic core issue that people would agree with. They might disagree on other issues, that's fair enough. There are, different ways of going about it, but that was the idea, was to go for what you might call the lowest common denominator, to attract people with disparate views. Getting elected to Parliament is not the issue. It's getting the issue. It's getting the issue of money reform into the public domain, so that people will begin to talk about it.
Banks should not be able to gamble with your money without your permission. So what they would need to do is offer two types of account. One is a safe, we call it a transactions account. You put your money in there, the bank doesn't lend it, they don't put it at any risk whatsoever. The other is an investment account where you put your money in for a certain period of time and then the bank takes that away and they invest it. What happens when you use these two types of account is that in the event that a bank fails, the money in the safe accounts is still there, it's not at risk. So you just move all the safe accounts to a bank that's still healthy. And then those people who put their money in the investment account, they don't lose everything, but they have to wait for the standard liquidation procedure to find out how much of the assets of the banks will be returned to them. And it means that the government then never needs to bail out a bank. Banks can be allowed to fail.
The system would actually be how people think it is, that when you put your money in the bank it's really safe, or at least they used to think perhaps before the 2008 crisis. There's a spectrum of opportunities there which we're just not exploring at the moment, and that's That's what's upsetting me, that we're not even experimenting when we know that the system we have now is fundamentally flawed.